Once upon a time, in the busy city of Asaba, there lived a man whose heart was darker than his smile. His name was Kingsley, and he was a man who prayed for his wife to die during childbirth. However, to anyone who saw him, he looked like a devoted husband and a responsible man. He dressed well, spoke softly, and never missed church on Sundays. People often pointed at him and said, "That man is God-fearing." What they did not know was that behind closed doors, Kingsley carried a secret so wicked that even the walls of his house seemed to recoil in shame. He was married to a woman named Funanya, a quiet and gentle woman whose only crime in life was loving him too deeply. Kingsley did not marry Funanya out of love. He married her out of obligation. She had gotten pregnant, and his family had forced him to do the right thing. But deep in his heart, Kingsley's love belonged elsewhere. He had another woman, one who he believed was his true soulmate. Every day he looked at Ifunanya, he saw chains. Every time she smiled at him, he felt trapped. And as fate would have it, the day had come when Ifunanya was in labor, fighting for her life in a hospital bed, while Kingsley sat comfortably at home, praying not for her survival, but for her death. Ifunanya had always been a soft woman, the kind whose voice never rose above a whisper, even when life dealt cruelly with her. From the day that she found out that she was pregnant, she had held on to hope. Hope that the child would soften Kingsley's heart. Hope that marriage would turn obligation into love. She endured his coldness, his silence, and the way he never looked at her for too long. When labor pains began in the early hours of the morning, Kingsley did not rush her to the hospital with panic or fear. He drove calmly, almost relieved, as though he was dropping off an unwanted package. At the hospital, he kissed her forehead lightly and said, "You'll be fine," before leaving to go home and pray. Ifunanya smiled weakly, trusting him with her life. But back home, Kingsley locked himself in his bedroom, knelt beside his bed, and clasped his hands together. But the words that left his mouth were not words of love or concern. He prayed that the doctors would fail. He prayed that complications would arise. He prayed that Ifunanya would not survive childbirth. In his mind, her death would set him free. Free to marry the woman he truly loved. Free from guilt. Free from responsibility. What he did not know was that heaven was listening. Kingsley's prayers were filled with desperation, not faith. He paced the room, kneeling, standing, kneeling again. "God," he whispered, "you know my heart. You know I never wanted this marriage. Please, let this end today." Outside, rain began to fall heavily, thunder rumbling like a warning from the skies. Still, Kingsley prayed on. He imagined life without Ifunanya, her quiet presence gone, her soft footsteps erased from his house. He imagined calling his lover with good news, imagined mourning publicly while celebrating privately. Meanwhile, in the hospital, Ifunanya screamed in pain as nurses rushed around her. Her labor was long and difficult. Hours passed, and the doctors grew concerned. She had lost too much blood. Her heartbeat weakened, and the baby was now in distress. The doctor shook his head and said, "We need her husband immediately." Calls were placed to Kingsley, but his phone lay face down beside his bed, silent. He was too busy praying for death to hear the call for help. Ifunanya drifted in and out of consciousness, whispering her husband's name, believing that he was somewhere praying for her to survive. What she did not know, that the man she loved was begging God to take her life. And as the night stretched on, fate began to shift its weight. By dawn, the hospital room smelled of antiseptic and fear. The doctors worked tirelessly, but the situation worsened. Finally, a senior doctor spoke with a heavy voice. "She needs a red blood transfusion immediately," he said. "Her blood type is extremely uncommon." Nurses scrambled, checking blood banks, calling emergency contacts. Time was now running out. Ifunanya lay pale and weak, her lips dry, her body trembling. The baby's heartbeat slowed dangerously. Back at home, however, Kingsley felt a strange tightness in his chest. His prayers suddenly felt heavy in his mouth. He tried to continue, but the words refused to come. At that same moment, his phone rang loudly, startling him as it rang. When he answered, the doctor's voice was firm and urgent. "Your wife is dying," he said. "We need you at the hospital now." Kingsley's heart skipped, not with fear, but with something close to relief. So he grabbed his jacket, already rehearsing fake tears in his mind. But before he could leave, the doctor added words that made him freeze. "You are the only known match for her blood type. Without your blood, she and the baby will not survive." Kingsley's knees buckled. The room spun. The woman who was praying to die needed him now to leave. Kingsley arrived at the hospital sweating, his face pale, his hands trembling as he sat. The doctor wasted no time explaining. "Your blood can save her," he said, "but you must act now, sir." Kingsley stared at the glass separating him from Ifunanya's room. He could see her weak form on the bed, her stomach swollen, her life slipping away. His mind raced. If he refused, she would die, and he would finally be free. No one would know. It would look like a tragic childbirth complication. But if he agreed, she would leave, and his prison would continue. His lover's face flashed through his mind. Their promises, their plans, the life he believed he deserved. Slowly, Kingsley shook his head. "I can't," he said. "I'm not feeling well." The doctor looked at him in disbelief. "Sir, this is your wife and child," he said. "Your own child." Kingsley turned away, his heart pounding. He signed the form refusing the transfusion and walked out of the ward. Inside, Ifunanya's condition worsened rapidly. Alarms beeped, nurses shouted, and just as the sun rose fully into the sky, Ifunanya slipped into unconsciousness. The baby was delivered stillborn. Doctors fought to save her, but without the transfusion, her organs began to shut down. Kingsley sat outside, staring at his hands, whispering, "It's over, it's over." But destiny was not done with him yet. They found a match in the hospital, a man who came to visit his ailing sister and heard of her condition. He offered to help, and the doctors went straight to work. The stranger was rushed in for tests, and within minutes, the results confirmed what everyone had been praying for. He was a perfect match. Nurses moved swiftly. Blood was drawn. Drips were prepared. Life was slowly pumped back into Ifunanya's failing body. Outside the ward, however, Kingsley watched everything unfold with growing irritation. His relief had been short-lived. He had already accepted her death in his heart, already begun rehearsing the freedom he believed would follow. Now, here was a stranger, a complete outsider, interfering with what he believed should have ended a long time ago. Unable to contain himself, Kingsley stormed towards the man as he stepped out of the donation room, weak but calm. "Why would you do this?" Kingsley snapped bitterly. "Can't you mind your business for once?" The man froze, staring at him in disbelief. "Excuse me?" he asked. "Your wife and unborn child are dying, and instead of thanking me, you are insulting me?" Kingsley scoffed. "Nobody asked you to play hero," he said coldly. "Some things are better left alone." The man's brows furrowed as he studied Kingsley's face. In that moment, something clicked. No fear, no gratitude, no desperation, only anger. That was when the man realized something was deeply wrong. The stranger turned slowly towards the doctor and asked a question that made the room fall completely silent. "Has her husband been tested?" The doctor hesitated. "Yes," he replied carefully. "He is also a match." The man's eyes widened in shock as he turned to Kingsley. "You mean to tell me," he said slowly, "that you could save your wife, but you chose not to?" Kingsley said nothing. His silence spoke louder than words. The man took a step back, disgust etched across his face. "Your wife is in labor," he said, his voice shaking with anger. "She's fighting for her life, for Christ's sake, carrying your child, and you are here behaving like this?" Kingsley finally snapped. "You don't know anything," he shouted. "I never wanted this marriage. I never wanted this child." The words echoed down the hospital corridor like a slap. Nurses stopped walking. Doctors froze. The man stared at Kingsley as if he were looking at something inhuman. He could not believe how a man would sit back and watch his wife and child struggle for their lives when he had what it took to save them. Shaking his head slowly, the stranger looked Kingsley straight in the eyes and said, "Life is not a game you pause when it becomes inconvenient. Life is sacred, and a child is not a punishment. It is a responsibility." Kingsley scoffed and turned away, but the man's words hung in the air like a judgment already passed. He walked away, leaving Kingsley standing alone in the corridor, fuming in complete rage. Inside the delivery room, however, the transfusion began to take effect. Color slowly returned to Ifunanya's face as her breathing steadied. Moments later, the baby, who the doctors had declared stillborn, suddenly let out a weak but healing cry. Nurses froze in complete shock before springing into action. "The baby is alive!" one of them shouted as the room erupted into controlled chaos. Doctors worked quickly to stabilize the baby, and against all odds, both mother and child survived. Outside, when the doctor emerged with the good news, Kingsley felt the ground shift beneath his feet. "Your wife is stable," the doctor said, revealing that even the baby had survived. Kingsley said nothing. The prayer he whispered in secret had been rejected so loudly by the heavens. Now, not only would he live with the pain of being with a woman who he had no atom of feelings for, he would also have to live with a child that he wished he never had. Ifunanya regained consciousness a few hours later, and the first thing she asked for was her precious child. The baby was placed gently in her arms as tears streamed down her face. Ifunanya could not help but thank God for saving their lives. The news of everything that transpired finally reached her ear, and Ifunanya could not believe how vile her husband was. She remembered vividly how she sacrificed her fees to save his life a few years ago. Ifunanya was on her way back from school when she met him. They were on the same bus and coincidentally sat down next to each other. At first, Ifunanya tried to mind her business, but Kingsley began to bring up conversations. They spoke for hours until the tragedy that finally brought them together happened. The bus was involved in a fatal accident that left Kingsley unconscious. However, Ifunanya remained unharmed as she rushed him to a nearby hospital. The doctors requested for down payment before they could proceed with his treatment, and all Ifunanya had on her was her school fees, which she just collected from her poor mother, who had to sell the only parcel of land that her father left to secure the money. She was in her final year in the university, so her mother had to do everything possible to ensure that she graduates. Ifunanya in that moment had two options to choose from. It was either she paid for his hospital bill or abandoned him there to fate. She stood in the hospital corridor, clutching the brown envelope that contained her school fees, her hands trembling as she stared at his unconscious body. Time was fast slipping away, and Ifunanya could not see herself walking away without helping. Slowly, with tears burning in her eyes, she walked to the cashier's desk and handed the envelope over to him. "Please," she said softly, "use this to save his life." The cashier counted the money as the doctors proceeded with his treatment. And just like that, her dreams of ever graduating that year vanished before her eyes. Her mother even died of heartbreak, knowing that her daughter did not graduate. However, Kingsley was given another chance to live. He woke up days later, weak and confused, and Ifunanya was the first face that he saw. He asked to know how his bills were paid, and Ifunanya informed him that she used her fees. Kingsley wept like a child on hearing this. He began to promise her heaven on earth, as he could not believe how a woman would make such a sacrifice for a complete stranger. He then went on to promise her love, stating that destiny brought them together for a unique reason. Kingsley introduced her to his entire family, and his mother and sisters took a special liking to her. However, as the years went by, Kingsley fell in love with another woman. His conscience could not let him end things with Ifunanya, who he believed he owed his life. So, he began his secret relationship whilst pretending that he was still in love with Ifunanya. However, his true feelings were bared the moment Ifunanya informed him that she was pregnant. Kingsley exploded in rage. "How can you be pregnant?" he asked Ifunanya, who stood there shocked to see such a reaction from him. She had envisioned his happy dance, but was shocked to see the complete opposite playing out before her eyes. Things moved so fast from there as his family caught wind of the situation. They forced him into marriage with her, and Kingsley obliged because he promised himself years ago never to have a child outside wedlock. The wedding was quiet, almost rushed, and while people congratulated them, Kingsley's heart was miles away. He stood beside Ifunanya at the altar, smiling for photographs, while silently mourning the life he believed he had lost. From that day on, marriage became a cage to him, not a covenant. He provided for her needs, but starved her of affection. He spoke when necessary, and stayed silent when love was required. And Ifunanya, still believing in the man that she once saved, endured it all in silence. As the months passed and her pregnancy grew, Kingsley's resentment deepened. Every kick from the baby felt like a reminder of a future he did not want. He became irritable, distant, and cruel with his words. At night, while Ifunanya slept with one hand on her stomach, praying for a safe delivery, Kingsley lay awake beside her, texting the woman he truly loved, dreaming of freedom. By the time labor approached, his heart had hardened completely. And so, when the day finally came and Ifunanya was wheeled into the labor ward, Kingsley returned home and knelt to pray, not for strength, not for mercy, but for death. But heaven had a record of everything. It remembered the young girl who gave up her education just to save a stranger. It remembered the tears that she shed at the cashier's desk. It remembered the promises made on a hospital bed. And so, when Kingsley's wicked prayer rose, they collided with a louder truth: sacrifice. That was why Ifunanya lived. That was why the child cried again, not because Kingsley deserved mercy, but because goodness does not die quietly. Days later, Ifunanya was discharged from the hospital and returned home with her child. Kingsley was so cold and distant, he refused to carry the child, claiming that the baby was too fragile for him. He even moved out of their bedroom and began to keep late nights, seizing every opportunity to be away from them. One evening, he returned home and met his wife, who was waiting for him in the living room. The baby asleep in her arms, as her eyes were red from weeks of swallowed pain. "Kingsley," she said softly as she began to speak, "how long will you punish me and this child for simply being alive?" Kingsley scoffed, dropped his keys loudly on the table, and replied with venom. "You trapped me now," he said. "You ruined my life. Don't pretend you don't know." The words struck her like a slap. Ifunanya's knees buckled, but she steadied herself. For the first time in their marriage, she raised her voice at him. "I saved your life," she said. "I carried your child. I nearly died giving birth to him. And this is what I get?" The argument grew fierce as their voices began to collide. Years of bitterness poured out as the two yelled at the top of their lungs. In anger, Ifunanya wrapped her baby in a shawl and stepped out for some air. She went to the nearby beach, the one she always visited whenever her heart felt too heavy. The waves were so calm and the breeze gentle, but her mind was in a turmoil. She called her best friend Doris and poured out everything to her. Doris had been away for a work training. However, she got into the city that evening and promised to come see Ifunanya the next morning. Doris listened patiently as her friend narrated all that she had been going through for the past month. Her heart broke as she convinced Ifunanya not to be too hard on herself. "I will see you in the morning," she said as Ifunanya nodded her head and ended the call. Hours passed and Kingsley did not bother about his wife. All he was worried about was seeing the woman that he loved for the very first time. He did not care that his wife had not still returned by that time of the night. In fact, he slept like a baby as he looked forward to seeing his woman, who was scheduled to be in his city the next evening. Kingsley lied to her that he was still single. He could not risk losing a woman who brought nothing but joy to his life. After years of enduring their long-distance relationship, his woman was finally visiting the country to meet with him. Her name was Janet, and she lived and worked in the UK. Janet was an epitome of beauty, and Kingsley could not believe that he could ever be with a woman like her. The next morning, however, Doris woke up with a heavy feeling in her chest. She called Ifunanya's number again and again, but sadly it was not reachable. Panic set in as she called Kingsley, who had no idea where his wife was. "How can you be this calm when your wife is nowhere to be found?" she said to Kingsley, who could not wait for the call to end to enable him continue his chat with the love of his life. "Your wife called me yesterday on her way to the beach, but since then, I haven't heard from her," she said to Kingsley, who continued to sit there unbothered. Doris rushed off to the beach in search of her friend. She called her number repeatedly, but the number was still not connecting. Doris combed the entire beachfront and came across her friend's favorite slippers, the same slippers that she got for her when she returned from Lagos a few months ago. Doris screamed out in terror. She approached some fishermen who searched the ocean and found the body of a little baby. Doris could not hold back her terror. She screamed out as her entire body shook in pain. The fishermen stood back in silence, head bowed as the sea continued to crash gently against the shore. Doris clutched her chest and cried out Ifunanya's name over and over again, hoping and praying that this was a terrible mistake, but deep in her heart, she already knew. The baby was gone. News spread quickly as the authorities were called and the beach was sealed up for investigation. Doris dialed Kingsley's number again and again, her hands trembling as tears blurred her entire vision. When he finally picked up, her voice broke as she began to speak. "They found the baby," she sobbed. "They found the baby in the sea, and we need you to identify the child." The line went silent as Kingsley's heart skipped violently. But even then, his first thought was not of grief, it was of inconvenience. "I'll come later when I'm free," he said as he hung up the call, not caring that the world he helped destroy was finally demanding his presence. He slipped his phone back into his pocket, straightened his shirt, and glanced at his wristwatch, annoyed that the call had interrupted his plans. Doris stood outside the beach with the authorities, answering questions, while Kingsley got into his car and drove off to the hotel. He could not wait to meet Janet, the woman he had fallen deeply in love with, and Kingsley could not allow any more distractions. Minutes later, Kingsley arrived at the hotel where Janet was lodged, his heart racing with excitement as he knocked eagerly on the door. A stunning woman opened the door, her smile warm and inviting. Kingsley froze, overwhelmed. He hugged her tightly as they laughed like teenagers who just reunited after years of being apart. Inside the room, they talked endlessly, and Kingsley felt lighter than he had in years. He told himself he was lucky to be with an extremely beautiful and educated woman. Then, the room grew silent. Her silence began to trouble Kingsley, who asked what the problem was. "There's something I need to tell you," Janet said, as Kingsley turned to her as she began to speak. Janet explained that she was born male and had undergone gender reassignment surgery years earlier in the UK. She spoke calmly, trusting that Kingsley still accepted her for who she was, but Kingsley sat there shocked. He recalled as his face hardened like a rock. The entire room went cold as he stood up abruptly, anger and disgust flashing across his face. Words spilled out, harsh, unforgiving words, as Janet stared at him in disbelief, hurt replacing her hope. "I thought you loved me," she whispered as Kingsley stormed out without looking back. He drove aimlessly through the night, rage giving way to dread as he drove back home in anger. Shockingly, he saw his wife and her friend, who were both packing her bags as he pulled into the compound. Kingsley slammed the brakes, his heart pounding as he stepped out of the car. There stood Ifunanya, very much alive, holding her baby close to her chest. Her friend Doris stood beside her, zipping up the last suitcase that she had packed. Her eyes were so swollen from crying, but still, there was a calmness in them that Kingsley had never seen before, a calmness that terrified him to his bones. "What is going on here?" Kingsley demanded, his voice shaking as he asked his wife why she was packing. "Why are you packing?" Doris turned slowly to face him, her eyes blazing in anger. "Your wife and her child are alive," she said coldly. "The baby they found in the sea does not belong to Ifunanya. Another family is mourning tonight, and you couldn't even be bothered to show up." Kingsley's knees weakened. "Ifunanya," he whispered, stepping closer. "I told Doris that I was going to come, but something came up." Ifunanya raised a hand as she stopped him. "You were going to?" she said quietly. "But you didn't come. You didn't care. Even when you believed your child was dead, your plans mattered more." Tears finally spilled down Kingsley's face. "I was wrong," he cried. "Please don't leave me. We can fix this. I will change," he said as if Naya looked at him for a long moment. The man she once saved, the man she almost died for, the man who refused to donate his blood to save her life. Slowly she shook her head and revealed that some things cannot be fixed. "I forgive you, Kingsley, but forgiveness does not mean staying." She adjusted the baby in her arms. "I refuse to raise my child in a house where love is optional and life is disposable." Kingsley dropped to his knees, begging, apologizing, promising everything that he had once withheld, but her mind was already made up. The door of her heart had closed, and no amount of begging was going to make her stay. Ifunanya left his house without looking back. Kingsley stood alone in the compound, surrounded by the silence of his choices. For the first time in his life, the weight of what he had done settled fully on his chest. He had prayed for her death, treated her so unkindly, despite all the sacrifices she made for him. And that night, Kingsley learned a truth too late, that love ignored becomes love withdrawn, and goodness, once walked away from, does not always return. The lesson to be learned from this story is that Love is not proven by words, prayers, or public appearances, but by choices made when it matters most. A heart that repays sacrifice with cruelty will eventually lose what it took for granted. Forgiveness may heal the wounded, but it does not always restore broken trust. When responsibility is treated as a burden and human life like an inconvenience, consequences will arrive quietly but firmly. This story reminds us that goodness should never be abused, and that those who pray for the downfall of others often end up losing the very blessing they never deserved.